Howdy, all you delicious people. X-Men Origins Wolverine. Funny enough, during the time of which that this was to be plopped out there, put out there, we were supposed to get supposedly an X-Men Origins Magneto. Funny enough, we ended up just getting X-Men First Class, and that's really, that's what ended up kind of churning out the factor of just, yeah, these X-Men movies are not quite as not quite as up to par as, I think that's kind of why, it seemed that Logan did do bigger and better things regardless, and so that's great as a solo thing, which ultimately I'm happy about. It's just the fact of, okay, we have seemingly, Wolverine is the only one solo that can work, to ultimately, when looking at it, when you go into an X-Men movie without Wolverine in it, not quite the same thing. It's kind of hilarious how it's just yeah, you can sell us a Wolverine movie, but you can't sell us an X-Men movie without Wolverine in it. It's kind of hilarious. New Mutants? Hey, you didn't have Wolverine? I don't care. You didn't have an X-23? Well, I'm out of here. So, for maybe most people. So, X-Men Origins Wolverine. This really, to me, I like this movie. I enjoy it, and some people might have loathed it, hated it, or when looking at it. For me, honestly, I'm going into it just because I feel like this is kind of a jumping off point for X-Men as a whole. You can ultimately say that's well, no, it's actually the first X-Men movie, or no, it's the X-Men First Class. That's the jumping off point. When looking at this, we end up having it to where this character has spanned decades upon decades of time. So when looking at it, you don't even know how old Logan actually is in this story. And ultimately, we probably get the best part about this movie to where we ultimately get also a real, true, legitimate, okay, well, there's some building blocks to this character. Ultimately, yeah, I can be 100% won over by this movie consistently, with some exceptions of there just being that kind of goofy ending that everyone has to laugh about. But reasonably overall, I'm kind of bought into this movie and I enjoy it. And when really looking at it, it's a building block to something. A building block to ultimately get me into other Wolverine movies. When looking at it, a lot of people would just say it's well, technically the X-Men movies do that for it. Yeah, but you could almost watch Wolverine just on its own. You could almost watch Logan on its own. Well, really Logan on its own. Because Logan kind of really leaves everything so mysterious that you're kind of just how about you give me a little bit more story, Logan? How about you just give me a little bit of something? There are no answers that way, Wolverine? Well, give me some at least. Give me some more answers. Give me some of those sweet, delicious answers so I can be happy. So going on into this, there's some grievances that I do have about this movie. One, if you've never seen this movie, I apologize because I'm gonna be talking about some characters that are gonna appear, but not story parts that appear. So we're gonna get to the cryptic part. One, my grievance is Gambit. Yeah, it's great that we got Gambit, because heaven forbid we never got Gambit before this or after this. Basically, this is the one Gambit time that we were ever going to get this character. They kept saying that, hey, yeah, guys, we're going to do a Gambit movie, or we're going to have Gambit tied to this X-Men movie, which they never did, and they still haven't. So, I'm hoping that maybe in a Deadpool movie, like Deadpool 3, maybe they could just tie Gambit to that entire thing, and that would be interesting. But again, a lot of people are just like, well, where could you go with that? Like, what could you do? I don't know. You could just have, like, basically, like, Gambit being a part of the Thieves Guild or whichever. Uh, have him part of the Marauders with that's how you can just add Sinister in that movie. Because when looking at it, I don't think the New Mutants are gonna garner really making a successful sequel because of how billions of years it took to get the first one out. So yeah, when looking at it, the New Mutants probably aren't gonna make enough splash to ultimately garner what they were going to do with that movie, which was ultimately going to be Mr. Sinister. So if anything of these are to happen in the future, and ultimately somebody's finally going and watching this review, then spoilers to future stuff if that ever happens. And if Gambit is never in a X-Men movie again, I will just be utterly just disappointed because they could finally change some stuff. They can finally fix some things finally. And when also looking at it, like Deadpool, even in his movies, tried to really go and say that this movie never even happened. So hopefully there's a chance that Gambit could be in a Deadpool movie that isn't the same Gambit, and ultimately there'll be a whole joke around that or something like that. But anyways, so I really like this film. There's stuff about it that ultimately like you can watch it and just you can get a good chuckle, you can have a good laugh at this movie. There is even like at points in time when looking at reasonably Fred Duke's character, like I was just kind of like, you know what? I really like the fact that it seems like they're going out of their way to try and give you a lot of the characters that everybody knows of, and I like the fact that they are really trying to give you a lot of different kinds of uh, spectrums of mutants. And so that's ultimately what I can like about this movie is that it kind of gives you a big variety. It kind of gives you a wide variety of different kind of like not every mutant you're gonna know right away. You're like, oh well, that's Will.i.am Wraith. That's the guy from Lord of the Rings. That guy is Bolt, and so on and so forth. Uh, Ryan Reynolds, who's that guy in this movie? I don't know. But he's definitely not Deadpool. But anyways, so I thought this movie's fun. I like the fact that we actually got a Gambit in this movie because we're never gonna get one again probably, and I like the fact that, like, for me, I was salivating on the fact that I'm like, oh, hey, these are all characters that I can go and look up and figure out who they all are. That was the selling point to me of this movie is after watching it, I'm like, oh man, I can go and pick up a comic book and see who these people are. Or in my approach, to pick up a Marvel encyclopedia and just scroll through it, ultimately just like, is Agent Zero in here? Is Remy LeBeau in here? Is Blob in here? I want to see who these people are. I want to get more of their backstory. Even though I was quasi familiar with them before this whole movie came out, and plus I played the video game also. The PS2 version, I never did play the, I guess, better version, which was ultimately the Xbox 360, whichever one that was actually way better and is supposedly the best superhero comic book movie, I guess, video game. So that's the best video game, I guess, out of all. Like, if you go through the top 10, everybody says, yeah, that one's the best. I never fully played through all of it. Like, I started it, but then ultimately I just was like, well, I couldn't record this, so what is the point of it? Um, because ultimately I played it when I had way before I even did YouTube or whatever. Like I found it and I was like, oh man, I'm gonna play this, but then I just never had time to really go through it. So if anything, the PS2 thing was just kind of like a bizarre hopping mechanic that I found it severely annoying. And Xbox 360 was like, oh hey, this variation, like you can actually fight people. Wow, that's actually amazing. So let's go into spoilers about this. Let's ultimately break it open and ultimately go into spoilers. I ultimately just was won over by this movie, just because I like certain things about it. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So the very first thing that I can spoil upon, my favorite thing about this movie is ultimately the bone claws, hands down. I like the fact that we had to work up to the animanium into Hugh Jackman. And when honestly looking at it, what if we had an entire Logan world where Logan had never gotten the animanium and he ultimately just had bone claws the rest of his life? He would have lived forever. He would have never gotten old. He would have never died, because ultimately the animanium was the thing that ultimately had, in the Old Man Logan story, had aged him and had ultimately killed him because of the animanium poisoning. So reasonably, if they would retcon it to ultimately, it's maybe in some story that maybe Wolverine never gets the animanium dipped into him, because when looking at it, uh, he'll die from it. That's ultimately why in this movie that ultimately they did not. They didn't give it to Creed. They didn't give it to Victor, because ultimately it wouldn't have worked for anybody. It didn't work for anybody, but like it wouldn't have even worked for Logan. So that's why Stryker was like, "Well, no, I don't want you to get the animanium because it'll be poisonous," and so that's why he was trying to keep Victor at his side. Interestingly enough, so going on into this movie, let's go into the very beginning. So we end up having to ultimately, in this beginning, we end up having to where Wolverine ultimately sick as a young little lad. Ultimately, we have to where Victor is ultimately saying, "God, you're always sick," and Logan is just like, "Well, you were sick when you were my age. You were sick a lot when you were my age." So we ultimately have to where ultimately Logan is to be with the Howlettes, which ultimately I'm like, hey, let's go and get a towelette. Which ultimately meet and greet the Howlettes. Just bizarre. Anyways, so we have the Howlettes and we ultimately have John Howlett ultimately going and trying to take care of Logan. But then eventually we seemingly have a banging and knocking and all kinds of craziness going. We ultimately have it to where Thomas Logan ends up going into the home to ultimately say, hey, how's it going? How's your uncle? Bob's your uncle? No. He ends up going in and ultimately going and trying to find his son, which if you hear the last name Logan, you can probably figure out which son he's looking for. Weirdly enough, we end up having it to where ultimately John turns to, or Howlett turns to Victor and ultimately says, I think your father needs help going home. Because ultimately he's drunk again. And so we end up having to where Victor says, like, well, he's not yelling for my name, so I'm not gonna go and help him. John Howlett goes and greets Logan, or Thomas Logan, to ultimately end up with a slug in his chest. So we end up hearing the gunfire. Ultimately, Logan and Victor ultimately go go to see what had happened. Ultimately, to find out that John Howlett had died, and so ultimately Wolverine is now angry. He's like, "Yeah!" And then you could just see the bone claws popping out, and then ultimately he ends up going and running towards Thomas Logan, and ultimately just stabbing into the guy. And ultimately, we end up having it to where Thomas Logan says like I'm sorry, son, or something along those lines of just like you're my son. And so ultimately, we end up finding out that James is actually a Logan. Oh, that's too bad. So we end up finding out that Logan had killed his own father, biological father, I guess. And so we end up having it to where both Victor and Logan end up running off because they're brothers and they have to protect one another. And ultimately, Elizabeth is seeing them as basically like, you're freaks. Like, get out of my house. So we end up having them run off into now a seemingly time montage of them basically running into every single historical battle seemingly known to man. And there's just these repetitious moments of them either fighting in some time period or ultimately going back to back, and they're ultimately just flinging guns and popping out bone claws and bag lady nails and all kinds of things to ultimately fight off people. Yeah. Like, this sequence is so cool. Like, this is a really good opening to this movie, and this is the best way to showcase somebody that has lived for years of time. Like, they can't, like, we have it to where, like, there's very few movies that do this anymore because there's very few people that they write that has lived forever. Like, the only real true thing that I remember things being done this way is probably Highlander, because they're of course immortal, so they have to have like several branches of time. I think that ultimately they try to avoid that kind of thing because they don't want to probably spend a ton of money on antique and time period things and so on and so forth, just to, or they have to go to specific locations to get certain time period objects and whatever. So moving on. So we end up having it to where eventually it seems over time that it seems that more and more that Victor is getting very aggressive within these wars. And we end up having it to where Logan is consistently like is pulling him back. Victor! And trying to pull him back, and ultimately and Victor is ultimately just like come on man, like it's war. So we end up having it to where Victor goes way too far to ultimately just end up going and almost killing seemingly his own man. And so that is when ultimately we end up having to where Victor and Logan are to end up being seemingly to be shot down by their own military force, to ultimately be tied to some stick somewhere, and to ultimately be shot by a firing squad because they disobeyed, they killed a superior, and all kinds of things. So they end up getting shot up, and ultimately we end up having it to where Victor ultimately turns to Logan and ultimately says, "Wake me when it's over." So we end up having it to where both of these, of course, characters end up surviving, just to be thrown, I guess, into some stockade of sorts or something along those lines, to ultimately have it to where seemingly that that we are going to have Stryker go and retrieve them, to ultimately say, "I'm putting together a special team of muties." Men with special skills that can do special things. Double special. So we end up having it to where ultimately Stryker ultimately says it's like, well, hey, I know that you guys don't like authority, and ultimately Victor's like, yeah, of course not, and Logan's like, shut up. So we end up having to where ultimately they otherwise just decide to just like, well, dude, we're either gonna be like staying in this like hole forever or go with Stryker. So we might as well just go with Stryker. So we end up having it to where ultimately that we are to have seemingly Stryker go and put together a special team to do a special task force. So, and here's a really cool part that I wish that we could have gotten more of in this movie, just to see like a bunch of these characters working side by side together, and like I thought that that would have been much more interesting. So we end up having to ultimately we are going on and having these guys all fly in to Legos. And ultimately I'm like, oh, okay, like when looking at this, I'm like, Legos is also used in Captain America's Civil War. When Captain America's Civil War happened in Legos, I was like, yeah, like ultimately I remember X-Men Origins where it took place in Legos. It's like, all right, this is kind of like familiar territory technically in a kind of different company, whatever thing stuff. So we end up having it to where we pop down into Legos, and we ultimately have it to where ultimately Agent Zero is to go first to ultimately shoot all these guys. Here's my problem that I have with Agent Zero firing away at his guns. I'm like, okay, this gunfire does not make sense with the gun that ultimately Agent Zero has. Like, his guns are sounding and firing off like machine guns, and he has a regular gun. This makes no sense. We end up having to ultimately he doesn't have a clip or anything like that that looks like a machine gun like clip into his regular pistol. So how exactly would any of this work? It doesn't make sense to me. Is Agent Zero firing faster than a normal gun? I don't know. Doesn't quite make sense. But every single time I hear a firing off of that round, I'm like, that makes no rational sense in my mind of how that is supposed to sound. But I guess it is what it is. So we have it where Zero is to start taking care of one of the guys, as well as we also have it to where Deadpool ultimately Ryan Reynolds, Wade Wilson was in the helicopter, ultimately mentioning before they are to land. We ultimately find out that Wolverine in this movie is, of course, like he gets like airplane and helicopter sickness, I guess. So ultimately he's like, he's like ultimately like, hey, you need a bucket. Like, he's like, if we were meant to fly, we'd have wings, and ultimately it's like, well, uh, it sucks to be you. So we end up having to where Deadpool has this conversation with Victor, ultimately having talking about that he loves his blades because when whipping out uh, dual blades at a wedding, it's memorable. And we end up having to ultimately uh, like Deadpool also have to get some shade to saber-tooth weapons of choice, which ultimately his fingernails of a bag lady, and ultimately he's also making fun of Wolverine for having bone claws and all kinds of weird, bizarre abilities. So moving on, so Agent Zero ends up taking out all of the men, and ultimately we have Fred Dukes taking out the tank. Ultimately putting his fist through the tank thing, and then I guess they shoot out the tank, they take out the tank with ultimately the guy firing around, and then it just backfiring on him, I guess. What a goofy thing. Anyways, so we go on, and ultimately it seems that Victor is having fun with this. It seems like everybody's having fun with this. Wolverine is just like business as usual, so on and so forth. we end up having them going into the elevator, and ultimately we have Bolt, who is Chris Bradley, who is Dominic Monaghan, ultimately is to go and control this elevator, and so they end up getting stuck, but then Bradley ends up fixing it. And so while that's going on, we end up having a tour. Of course, Deadpool is to give another joke, or Wade is to give another joke about like, yeah, five five guys on a whole protein diet. Like dreams really do come true. And ultimately, like Logan's like, do you ever shut up? It's like not while I'm awake. So we end up having a tour. Ultimately, like I like the fact that eventually, like Stryker has to eventually make this pun, which ultimately comes up. So we end up having to where ultimately Wade is to go and seemingly kill all of these guys by having his blades going so extremely fast that he is to cut a bullet in half. And like this is the weirdest approach to having Deadpool beat Deadpool in this movie. It's bizarre. Like there's so many things that kind of go a little bit of like this would not work for any number of these characters, but I guess it just does, or it has to for a movie. So we end up having to our Deadpool ultimately is to kill everybody by ricocheting bullets with his blades, which ultimately is bizarre. And so ultimately we have to our Blade, where Wade ultimately says like, hey, everyone's dead now, come on out. So we end up having it to where there is one guy that is still alive that is going to be able to give uh, Stryker some information, because we end up having it to where uh, Stryker is to go to to get some rock, and ultimately he wants more resources of this than just this one rock. He wants more to be able to find out where this is. So we end up having to a Wraith ultimately is to stop this guy from grabbing his double barrel shotgun, and so we end up having to where Stryker ultimately tells Wade, it's like, well, hey, like if you didn't have that mouth on your Wade. So we end up having to ultimately that Stryker is to ask for where more of this rock is, where more of this animanium is. And ultimately we have to where the guy gives up this information. So we end up having to where all the guys end up going on to and finding this group of people that ultimately is to give us this information. And we end up having it to where this guy ultimately says that it's sacred and won't give up the information no matter what. So we end up having to where ultimately Stryker is threatening them, and ultimately Logan is like, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. So we end up having to where ultimately people are starting to basically get more and more aggressive. We eventually have it to where Victor is ultimately going and grabbing somebody and basically torturing him for this information. We end up people having to be scattered. We end up having Zero kind of popping off shots. Wolverine ends up tackling under the ground. Ultimately, Wade is to kind of start taking out his blades. We end up having to where everybody is just kind of like, okay, I guess we're going to have to just start killing innocent people. And ultimately, it's like Logan's like, you know what, this isn't what I signed up for. Like, I'm leaving. I'm bouncing. And so we end up having to where Logan takes his dog tags, and ultimately he's telling Victor, he's like, hey, you coming? Ultimately, Victor's like, no, you don't screw up a good thing that we have here. Like, come on. Like, let's do this. Let's finish this job. Logan's like, no, I've had enough. So he leaves. He walks off, going on to his own devices. So we end up queuing up Canada, seemingly years later, and ultimately we end up having it to where seemingly Wolverine is happy living a life with a girl named Kayla. And so we eventually have it to where ultimately Logan is to go on to seemingly his lumberjack job, where ultimately he is to be surprised by Stryker. Ultimately, kind of like, Logan, you haven't aged a day. Ultimately, it's like, must be all the clean living. So we end up having to ultimately, Agent Zero is kind of there, and ultimately he fires off a round to ultimately take out Logan's cigar, which is kind of a funny approach to like, yeah, you're still chewing on cheap cigars. So we end up having this line of dialogue, and so ultimately, Stryker is to stop Zero from getting any more of Logan riled up, and so ultimately we end up having to where uh, Zero ends up going back to the car, and that's when Logan ultimately goes, you're like, giddy up, boy. Yeah, you're a freaking dog, you schmuck. I like the scene before where ultimately we also have it to where Logan is to be on this bridge, and we end up having to where Logan is like going and like, hey, could you just move your trucks? Like, come on, like I just want to get by. And ultimately the guy's like, no, my conversation is just so vitally important that we cannot move our vehicles. Like, if anything, like, hey, like, I'm having a very important conversation and nothing can interrupt that conversation. And so we end up having to where this guy kind of shoves Logan, ultimately calling him a runt. And we end up having to where Logan ultimately gets the bone claws off. And we have Kayla, who ultimately stops the two. Ultimately says, can't you just move your truck, like, so we can get by? Like, my boyfriend here has a really bad temper. Let's just resolve all this. So we end up having to ultimately, um, Logan goes in the car ultimately to say it's like, oh, like, how did you get him to move his truck? It's like, oh, female powers of persuasion. It's like, oh, do you have any powers of persuasion on me? It's like, well, you didn't get back in the car now, did you? So moving on. So we end up having to ultimately we find out that, speaking of Kayla, so we end up having at points in time where Logan is to see young kids with his fathers, and ultimately it's a very tender and very sweet moment where ultimately we kind of see like what is a life that is possible for Logan to have, but he will probably never have. So we end up having to eventually. So Logan is to go off to his job and talk to Stryker that basically there is somebody after their old team. Because ultimately we end up finding out that supposedly Bradley had been killed via his amusement park or his carnival. Because ultimately we end up having to where Bradley ultimately was a guy that would have this trick where a light would continue to be turned on with three pulls, and ultimately no one would be able to figure out how to turn the light off. And so ultimately, Bolt ended up just going and like, yeah, well, like I'm making my money hand over fist for all these stupid people that ultimately it's just like an ability that he has that he can turn this light on and keep it on. And ultimately we have to where ultimately the people are saying it's like, oh well, it's just a trick, and it's not a trick, it's an ability. So we end up having to where Victor ends up going and killing Bradley, and so ultimately we end up having to where ultimately Bradley is to be dead, and so ultimately Stryker is to warn Wolverine, is like, hey, somebody's going after our old team. Ultimately, Stryker had said that Victor is okay. He's kind of hidden and whatever, but we'll find that out. So we end up having to where Victor is to go after Kayla, eventually to kill her, and ultimately we have to eventually Logan can sense that in the woods. He can track his scent. And so we end up having to eventually Logan runs off to eventually find Kayla, and eventually finds her dead. So, where he's like, "Rah!" So we end up having to where Logan ends up going and seeking out Victor, ultimately to go to a bar to have a fight out, ultimately to where Victor ultimately asks the bartender, it's like, hey, do you have insurance on this bar? And ultimately the guy's like, nope. He's like, too bad. So we end up having to where Logan ultimately comes in the bar and ultimately asks why. Victor is like, well, you don't call, you don't write. How exactly could I be able to get your attention? So we end up having to where the bartender's like, hey, if you guys are gonna have a fight, get it out of here. So we end up having to where they push on out of this bar and they ultimately fight it out. And like some interesting sequences are going on here, but it all leads to eventually Wolverine having his bone claws out, and eventually we have it to where Victor eventually goes and smashes each one of those bone claws. Breaking the bones of the bone claws, and like it's a very interesting scene. uh and ultimately you have Wolverine that's like, oh my god, like, because breaking bone. So we end up having to ultimately, Wolverine is to go to a hospital because he's badly injured, but then eventually of course he has a healing factor, so what does it really matter? We end up having to ultimately, Stryker is to show up at the hospital, and we end up having to where Logan ends up grabbing Victor by the neck and choking the life out of him. It's like, dude, like, all of a sudden you show up and all of a sudden she's dead. Because we end up having to ultimately, Kayla is having a conversation with Logan about Kue Kawatsu, who had ultimately gotten tricked by this trickster about giving flowers to the moon and stuff along those lines. And ultimately, at the end of the story, not being able to touch the moon again and not being able to touch her, who is the moon. And ultimately, we end up having to where Wolverine is like, oh, Cuckoo Chu got screwed. And Kue Kawatsu, which ultimately means the Wolverine. So technically, it seems that every single one of these Wolverine movies, we have to go into telling some variation of what is the Wolverine to whichever story. Like, as if we're going through every single one of these movies and somehow we have to work in the Wolverine and some, like, yeah, like, this is the reason why, like, hey, you're the Wolverine. It's like I think in the sequel movie, we end up having to where Wolverine's girlfriend in that movie ultimately says it's like, well, yeah, like, I had gotten a excuse me, I had gotten a childhood story that kept me safe at night. Ultimately, hearing about a creature or something that would help me or whatever, and ultimately Logan became that to her, I guess now. So, but anyways, moot point. So going back, so because Kayla's dead, I just wanted to get that story out. So, or what we are led to believe. Dead. So we end up having to ultimately, Victor is to ultimately mention, it's like, she's dead. You came here and she's dead. So we end up having to where, like, we end up having to where Logan is like saying like, why didn't you tell me it was Victor? So we end up having to where Stryker ultimately mentions that it's like, well, like, I didn't know, and then ultimately it ended up, he like said it's like, well, his appetites were becoming too public, and ultimately like things had gone awry, and so we eventually have it to where ultimately Wolverine is like, dude, I'm gonna go and find him, and we end up having to where good God, why am I consistently forgetting his name? Stryker ends up saying that, well, you can't beat him. And so ultimately, that's when he says, like, I can give you the tools to defeat him. So that's when we have to dip him into the animanium bath, or to ultimately go and get his claws. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Wolverine has to volunteer for this, and ultimately he's going to get the most pain that he's ever had in his life, and so on and so forth. So we end up having to where in this experiment, we end up having to where ultimately that Logan has to do this without getting a sedative because it won't work on him. So he has to do it fully awake to have just needles just jabbed into his body and so on and so forth. So we end up having to ultimately Wolverine is going through this procedure, and ultimately the general is ultimately mentioning like, why is he thrashing like that? No sedatives. He has to forcibly go through this procedure, so on and so forth. So we end up having to where Logan ends up going through this long procedure. He ultimately at some point dies, but then comes back to life. And so we end up having to ultimately uh, that Wolverine is to ultimately be fine with his procedures. So we end up having to where Stryker is ultimately saying like, hey, let's wipe his memory and move him to a different part of the island and so on and so forth. So we end up having to ultimately Wolverine hears this, he ultimately runs away, and we end up having to where Wolverine ends up running away naked, seemingly to a barn that seemingly has Heather and Travis Hudson. Eventually, we have an old man end up finding him and ultimately saying like, "Hey, you're naked." Like, just get a little cold there, Sonny, and so on and so forth. So fast tracking through all of that stuff. Because I'm gonna fast track through a lot of that. A lot of that stuff is just all like they're kind of funny jokes, but there's a lot of wasted time kind of spent here with this old couple and Wolverine. We get it to where Wolverine ultimately realizes that he has adamantium claws and cuts a sink in half, and ultimately he's like, oh, fandangling with that. Oh wow, that's so impressive. But eventually we have it to where Travis ultimately gives Wolverine his iconic jacket that he's been wearing seemingly for decades upon decades of Wolverine movies. And so we end up having to ultimately, like, Wolverine is given his jacket and ultimately given a motorcycle. And so here's where we end up having it to where Agent Zero is to come in here and ultimately shoot Heather and then ultimately shoot Travis. So we end up having to ultimately the barn is to be blown up after that, where Logan is to be, of course, motorcycling his way out of it. So we end up having to where Zero ends up going into a helicopter to chase after Logan, and of course, cool action scenes with helicopter and whatever. We eventually have it to where eventually Logan is to take out the army vehicles, but then eventually also go and fly into the air to take out this helicopter and just start tearing it apart to where ultimately the helicopter eventually crashes. And Stryker is ultimately trying to get Zero to confirm that Logan is dead, and Zero can only confirm that he's down. So we end up having to ultimately Wolverine is ultimately getting Zero's mic and ultimately telling him it's like, hey Stryker, you wanted the animal? You got it. You got the animal. So we end up having to ultimately Wolverine is to tell Zero, hey, you killed a lot of innocent people there. And Zero said it's funny how so many innocent people tend to die around you. So Logan ultimately says like, huh? Well, you're gonna be the next one. And we end up having to our flames from Logan's clawed sparks ultimately ignite this gas to ultimately blow up this helicopter. So pushing on. So we end up having it to where it seems that Stryker is on the island. It seems that ultimately Wolverine needs to figure out where the island is, and so ultimately he ends up going to Wraith to ultimately get a download of information of what happened after he left. Because we end up having to ultimately that there was things that happened after Logan. They ended up wrangling up mutants in Wraith's words, like going after their own kind, and so we end up having to where, like, what happened to Victor was, like, basically his hunting and killing whatever he was born at and blah, blah, blah. So, it seems that the only person that has information about the island is ultimately Fred Dukes, which ultimately is a guy that is called Blob in here. Uh, or made fun of to be called Blob. So, we end up having to ultimately... Wraith says the only way that he's going to get information uh, of the island is ultimately to go and talk to Dukes. But Dukes doesn't want anything to really do with Logan. But ultimately, if Logan could just kind of figure out a way to talk to him, then maybe there's some way. So we end up having to ultimately... Logan is to go and approach Dukes and ultimately start making some jokes there about, hey, fat Fred, whatever. Ultimately, all these kinds of things, and then ultimately he ends up saying, like, hey, give me the information, bub. And I'm like, Fred ultimately says, like, did you just call me Blob? Ultimately he says no, and that's when ultimately Fred pops him one. So we end up having to... Wraith had told him before, like, hey, don't mention his weight. And eventually when Wolverine got popped, we end up having where Wraith says again, like, dude, you shouldn't have mentioned his weight. Like, dude, I didn't mention his weight. So we end up having to ultimately boxing match. We end up having to eventually, of course, Wolverine now having seemingly adamantium metal body parts. We eventually have to where Wolverine ends up taking Fred Dukes down because he has metal bones throughout his entire body, so he uses that to advantage. So eventually he ends up getting the information about the island. Ultimately, we have to where Fred ultimately mentions about Fred Dukes, or Fred Dukes. Ultimately mentions about Remy LeBeau, ultimately gambling, gambling from the guards. LeBeau took all of their money, so they call him Gambit. So, and ultimately this guy is in New Orleans. So we end up having to where Gambit is supposedly the only guy that had escaped from the island, and so Logan is wanting to escape back in. So we end up having to where Logan ends up going to New Orleans to go and find Remy. So we end up having to where while Logan is going to find Remy, Victor is going to find Wraith. Ultimately, to end up having it to where Victor ends up telling Wraith where, hey, like, I basically killed Fred Dukes. And Wraith ultimately goes like, oh, well, you're gonna die from that, or you're gonna die for that, and we end up having to where Victor ends up grabbing while Wraith is teleporting or kind of shifting. We end up having to ultimately Victor grabs Wraith's spine and ends up killing him. So we end up having to where Logan goes to Remy LeBeau, ultimately for Remy to ultimately ask him, like, well, do I owe you money? And ultimately Logan's like, no, but hey, you owe me some information, Buck. You owe me some information. Like, ultimately I want to get back to that island that you escaped from. And so ultimately we have to where Remy used to look at Logan and be like, hey, like, I've seen tags like that before. And ultimately that's when eventually Gambit ends up taking cards and just tossing them at Logan, having him just being shot out of a wall. So we end up having to a Wraith ultimately is to go into the back because he knew Remy would grab it, which ultimately means run off. And Wraith ended up meeting Victor instead. So we end up having to ultimately... Remy is telling Logan, I'm not going back to that hole. So we end up having to ultimately... Remy and Logan are fighting it out, and we end up having to where Logan ends up breaking Remy's stick. Ultimately, he ends up kind of going off and kind of shimmying away. And ultimately, Logan is trying to claw his way after him, so on and so forth. Eventually, Victor comes into the fold, and then eventually Logan is to give all of his attention on to Victor. Ultimately, they are going to attack one another, and eventually, Victor seems that he is really very much more quite outmatched because Wolverine now has metal claws. So, we end up having to ultimately, this has led to reasonably them, like Victor ending up getting away because Gambit gets in the way. And so we end up having to eventually that Logan is to obtain Gambit and ultimately say, hey, like, I'm going to kill everybody that you hate in this world if you just let me know exactly where it is I can go and get there and do that. So Remy takes Logan on a plane ride, which is a plane that he barely won, jacks over fives. And so ultimately we have it to where Remy is to go to this island with Logan, and so we end up having it to where Logan makes his way uh, to the establishment, to the place, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Logan is to meet up with Stryker, and ultimately we end up having it to where Stryker ends up going like, well, hey, like, I needed your powers for the pool, the Deadpool, Ryan Reynolds. So we end up having to ultimately Stryker is telling Logan, it's like, yeah, I told you before that you won't like where this road is going to travel to. Because we ultimately have it to where Kayla ends up re-arriving and she's completely and utterly alive. Ultimately, to tell that she had been tricked, um, or she had tricked him like the story that she had told him before. And so we end up having to where Stryker says that she has powers of persuasion, and that's why uh, she fell in love with him. And so we end up having to ultimately. Logan is otherwise just horrified by the fact that Kayla is ultimately still alive, and so eventually we have it to where Victor is kind of bickering and whatever um, about because we end up having to where Logan ends up running off because he's just kind of ticked that ultimately Kayla is still alive, and while Victor is to go and talk to Stryker about give me the animanium, Stryker says like, oh no, the tests come back, you wouldn't survive. Eventually, Kayla ends up going and mentioning to Stryker, it's like, well, hey, give me back my sister. I did everything that you asked. Ultimately, Stryker's like, well, we still need some tests. We end up having to eventually Kayla gets in the way of Victor, and Victor ends up grabbing her and ultimately saying like, how about you die for real this time? So we end up having it to where Logan comes back to ultimately now go and fight Victor, which ultimately leads into them crashing through a window to land somewhere. Which ultimately Victor is going to kill, or Wolverine is going to kill Victor, but we end up having to where Kayla is trying to convince Logan, it's like, hey, you're not an animal. It's like, if anything, all of this was real for me too, and so on and so forth. I didn't use my powers on you. So we end up having to where Victor or to where Logan ends up kind of undoing his claws and punching him in the face. Yeah, punch that man in the face. Ultimately, Kayla is told me say, hey, they got my sister, man. They got my sister, so that's the only reason why I did this. So Logan ends up going and freeing the young mutants, ultimately for them to go on their way to ultimately have Kayla get shot, because movie, and we end up having to where Stryker's ultimately saying like, release Weapon 11. Ultimately, Doctor's like, well, can't do it. He's like, do it anyways. So ultimately, the 11 weapon is Deadpool, Ryan Reynolds. So we push on. So we end up having to ultimately. So we have uh, the young X-Men all going out to eventually finding the helicopter that ultimately has Patrick Stewart, Charles Xavier, and they are all saved. So, pushing on. So, we end up having to ultimately that Wolverine is ultimately ending up seeing Weapon 11, and that is, of course, of Deadpool. And ultimately, Logan's like, well, hey, they finally found a way to shut you up. So we end up having to where Logan and Deadpool end up fighting out. We end up finding that this Deadpool ultimately has blades like Wolverine has bone claws, and so it's kind of very interesting and whatever, what have you. But anyways, so we end up having to ultimately fight it out, and ultimately, like Logan ends up like putting a blade through, or putting a fist of blade through Deadpool, and Logan realizes how quick he's healing. He's like, oh crap! It's like, yeah. So we end up having to where Logan and Deadpool are fighting it out, ultimately to go up all kinds of places, and eventually we have it to where we end up having to where Victor ends up going and also trying to get into this fight with Deadpool, because it seems that this is like basically Victor is saying it's like the only person that can kill you is me, and so ultimately we have to where Victor and Logan have to go back to back and do this one last thing together. And so we end up having it to where ultimately that Victor and Logan end up just chopping up uh, Deadpool, and ultimately Deadpool eventually is also doing the Cyclops laser beams. So we end up having to eventually that Logan has his claws like just red hot to eventually go and slice off the head of Deadpool, and Deadpool ultimately his last gasp is to shoot off the Cyclops lasers to just go around and around and around on the place that they're at. So we end up having both of them both run off, both Victor and Logan. So we end up having to where ultimately at some point Remy had saved Logan from something, and we end up having it to where Logan ends up telling Remy, "Hey, go and find those kids." So we end up having to where Logan and Kayla end up meeting back up, and we eventually have it to where Stryker is going and getting the antimanium bullets to ultimately go and shoot at Wolverine's brain to ultimately make his brain all mushy and whatever, to where he would completely forget. So we end up having to where Stryker ends up going after Logan to pump him full of antimanium bullet. So we end up having to where Wolverine ends up going after Stryker to pop him full of bullet. We end up having to where eventually Stryker is to find Kayla by his leg, and so she ends up telling him, it's like, walk until your feet bleed. So he goes on and just walks forever. Told me say that this guy is going to be used at some point in some iteration of X-Men 2. So we end up having to ultimately that Victor's gone, Kayla's going to die soon, and we end up having to where Wolverine is just like, hey, I don't know what's going on, because once he does wake up, he eventually doesn't know who he is. Ultimately, Remy goes like, hey, these kids are gone, and ultimately, hey, let's get out of here. Like, we've done a lot of damage here, like, it's time to go. Ultimately, Logan says, like, well, I'm going to go my own way, and it's like, okay, fine. So we end up having it to where both of these leave and go, both these people leave and go their own way, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having to where the very tail end of this cutscene is told to me just have reasonably just Stryker just repetitiously continue to walk up until a point that ultimately he gets court-martialed, because they end up finding out uh, that he had killed one of the generals, uh, because ultimately the general had found out like, hey, we know your son's a mutant, and ultimately we're gonna shut this whole thing down. Uh, but then Stryker ends up killing the general to ultimately stop that whole thing from being shut down. So that is it. That is this movie. I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.